we 정재건과 김민영 believes that political parties are the flowers of the democracy. We of course concede to that. But if the political parties are the one who organizes, systemically organizes how to overthrow the current government, I think that's the time when we feel the imminent threat of the democracy. That's the time we give the right to the Supreme Court to dissolve the political parties. How am I going to proceed my speech? I'm going to talk about the definition of how do we actually give the rights to the Supreme Court to do this. I'm going to explain to you, number 2, why Supreme Court has this right not by the people. Number 4, why this specific case should be dealt in different manners according to the explanations of what recently happened in Korea, because we just recently dissolved the 통합진보당. I may want to refer it as a Radical Democratic Party, which was follower of North Korea. Right. Let's directly move on to the definitions of this debate. How to give power to dissolve political parties to the Supreme Court. To go back upon the history of Korea, it is a legalized law after military regimes of Korea where President Lee was throwing off one political party because he regarded one party as a competitor. He regarded this Democratic Party as a socialist party, which is a follower of North Korea, right? So after these oppressive presidents throwing off a lot of democratic parties, we thought we need a legalization of how to throw out parties, how to take out the parties when necessary, when there is an imminent threat. That's why we legalized this law after the military regime around 1970s, 80s. So let's move on directly upon why is it a Supreme Court? Why is it a justified way to give the power to this specific actor, right? So why Supreme Court? I think there is a natural checks and balance where it is it could represent the whole nation in its sense, because it is elected and it is appointed, 3 appointed by the cabinet, 1 appointed by the ruling party, 1 appointed by the opposition party, 1 appointed in a compromised way, and the other appointed by professional ways. I think these specifically and sufficiently and deservedly represent the idea of what could democracy could be. That's why we think it is appropriate for us and justified measure for us to give this power to the Supreme Court. Number 2, we also think it is the specific Congress we actually voted in, meaning these specific citizens in this own nation voted the people who's supposed to be the best representative of these individuals, so that we have a consent upon of the individual citizens in this specific country. 3, we also think Supreme Court is the best actor to represent the Constitution by our hand written. We think Constitution is the last measure when the government becomes oppressive. We think Supreme Court is a good checks and balances where the government becomes oppressive or citizen needs a good level of sufficient level of alert in this specific situation. Let's move on to why not then people, right? Because they might say people can do this by voting, right? If you don't just vote for this party, and the party is gonna just disappear. We oppose to this because we think there is a specific condition. We think 1, if we feel the imminent direct harm upon the country, we think we have good justification to do so. So what happened in this Korean history, right? You guys are all foreigners. I have to fill you in, right? Number 1, this 통합진보당, the Radical Democratic Party, is based on the Juche philosophy, which is the basis of the North Korea, where it has its own chains of commands where followers are not disregarded or irrelevant member of that specific party. They are specifically moving their taking their actions with the orders of the leaders. What happened was the guy named Lee, which is the leader of the party, was having a specific action plan to overthrow the government of South Korea when North Korea was already a threat. Regarding analyzing the background of what is happening now, is we are in a current war where North Korea is having a consistent threat upon South Korea, and we also have a national security law which have a check upon the overthrowing actions of the people in the South Korea. If the party is the one who is the main actor to overthrow the South Korean government, I think it should be regarded and interpreted as a imminent and direct harm upon this. we might hear from the opposition side that it is few members that who committed this action, so we should make him go to prison or actually, I don't know, make him suffer. I think this is just not sufficient enough because of the specific characteristics that I described to you. Because it is a philosophy where you can't opt any democratic ideas into that specific philosophy, which is Juche philosophy. Number two, because this party is specifically following a chain of commands where you cannot opt out from the command, you should just not be a member in the party when you want to opt out from the party, right? I think this specific situation limits the whole party members as the predators, as the people who are thinking of overthrowing the party. That's why one, national security law is not mutually exclusive in this debate if they suggest. Number two, it is just not sufficient enough to do so. Number three, why is it then, are we really just overthrowing a democratic party if they really think so? Because we just think that it is not same than any socialist party existing in the South Korea. Before I do so, please open it.
Are you place setting this debate solely on South Korea and you're only going to talk about the 통합 진보당, or are you actually talking about places that are less fucked up?
I think there is very few numbers of countries in this world who has legalized law to overthrow the political parties in this world. And I think the spirit of the motion is hitting, specifically targeting Korea, because we recently had a case of overthrowing a political party. If you want to move this place to other countries in CO, I think you could happily do so, right? Is it really a socialist party? Because we have socialist party in our own nation. We're not disregarding socialist party ideas. We're not disregarding any kind of ideas, not marginalizing. Because this is specifically the idea we want to kick it out because it is unconstitutional. We regard the North Korean as an illegal territory occupiers in the constitution's right. So we regard them as an illegal territorial occupier where they're staying in North Korea, having an imminent threat upon South Korea. If any party in a systemic way following and then want to achieve unification in the sense where it helps and gives advantages to the North Korea, I think that's the time it is okay for us to give this power to the Supreme Court, and we are very proud to propose.
Basically, the Prime Minister told you 2 or 3 maybe things. Number 1, that this debate is about South Korea. Number 2, that based on the national security law, this policy should be passed. And number 3, he likes the Supreme Court judges, right? First of all, the stance coming from the opposition side is that we, number 1, believe in the individual's freedom of belief, in individuals' freedom to act upon their belief. But secondly, we stand for the idea of social discourse, and that is the reason why, even regarding the national security law, we are perfectly happy opposing that and repealing that, right? I'm going to be giving certain corrections upon the ideas that JD talked about before I move into my substantives, right? Number 1, we tell you that based on the idea of harm principle, which is the only case where the state can curb or restrict individual freedom, certain ideologies in itself does not result in harm or tangible harm, right? We think ideologies by themselves are not harmful, and no harm has been done yet when you have created a party or you believe in a certain ideology. We don't think there's an existence of active harm. Secondly, we think we want to correct the kind of status quo that this debate is going to take place in, the context, right? Because we have seen in the international community already the very majority of the idea that people believe in is the idea that communism in general has failed. But secondly, the South Koreans specifically have the best example of North Korea right beside us that stands for and paints this idea of comparison that communism is an ideology that has failed and where people are suffering within the communist state. We think because of this, there is a vibrant check and balance that already exists within South Korea, but internationally, where people already recognize that even if we do allow these ideas to happen and flourish, these ideas are not really necessarily going to be end up being chosen by the people. But here's my third rebuttal, because I want to correct and question the idea of whether the Supreme Court really is the best actor to be able to represent the people, because we don't think so. We don't think that they are able to better represent the people in the sense that when you look at people that are voted into or elected as the members of the Supreme Court, they're traditionally and historically politically very conservative leaning, and they come from certain backgrounds, for example, being privileged and being able to get that education aspiration of majoring in law and studying law and becoming a member of the Supreme Court justice, right? Because of this, we don't really think that they're a proper representative of what people really think within the society. But having said this, our ultimate goal that we really want is better democracy. I'll be proving to you why that's only possible under the opening oblations model. Before that, any points?
We're not automatically throwing these parties away, right? We are going to check them if they are alright or having an oppressive idea on the threat.
JD. So right now he's swirling and going against all the ideas that he talked about in the Prime Minister's speech. We think that if you want a check and balance, that is completely possible under our opposition side. I already gave you the reason why it's possible, but I'll be continuing on in talking about this because what JD wants is a repeal and he wants to get rid of these parties basically, right? Sit down. Let's talk about my first idea about the political freedom of belief that these individuals are guaranteed to. We think number one, democratic states constitutionally guarantee certain rights to individuals, and we think the most important right that these individuals hold is the political freedom of belief or freedom of belief in general. Why are these rights important? Because we think that the freedom to think or freedom to believe in certain ideas or values are the most important foundation to an individual having any other social rights or any, arguing for certain policies that advocate for what they believe in.
Madam.
I think this is a very basic foundation for the system of democracy. Sit down. But secondly, we think only when individuals have the freedom to believe in whatever values that they want to believe, whether that belief is something that JD arbitrarily thinks is bad or good, we think only when people have this freedom can a vibrant check and balance be possible against the state itself and the state's over-exercising of power or too much force to individuals. Because we think that politics is ultimately about the relationship between individuals and states. Sit down. We think that only when we allow these parties to exist, only then can an actualization of those political rights that are principally inherent be possible through forms of speech or through forms of creation of parties. We think that this idea of collectivizing your thoughts through a party is no different from individuals themselves having and holding certain ideas, and we think it is sometimes the best way to actualize those ideas. Sit down. We think that even if South Korea suddenly does turn into communist by having these 통합진보당, we are actually perfectly fine with supporting that, engaging to the worst case coming from the opening government. And the reason why we're fine with it is because we think ultimately democracy is all about returning the power that the state has taken away from individuals and giving that back to the people, the rightful owners of the power, because they're the ones that are being ruled by the state to begin with, right? We think especially when individuals that were living in a democratic country voluntarily wanted to change their system to a communist one, that shows you that they feel that democracy has failed them and they're unhappy with the problems that democracy has. We think in this case, there is perfect legitimate reason why these individuals want to turn the country into a communist one. We think in that case that should be what takes place because we think ultimately in a democratic system there is no right or wrong, there is no correct answer. Sit down. But here's my second substantive. I'm going to be talking more about why their policy inhibits the discourse and why better discourse to becoming a more mature democracy can only take place under oppositions model. I already took one, right? We think that, like I established, the relationship between state and individual is important, but it's also flexible and it's adopted and it's incorporated by a competition of different models, right? We think that when you look at ideas of how these parties are going to actually stand, we think within within this 통합진보당 party, there will exist a certain level of check and balance that is inherent in any parties because they obviously also want the majority support of the people and they also want to represent the mandate of the people and garner the support. So we think that is the reason why even within this party, it's not going to become too radicalized and there is a certain incentive to become moderate and to become moderate among themselves. But secondly, when you look at examples of how within the German Communist Party or National Democratic Party, they also did allow people actively supporting and explicitly supporting the actions and ideologies of the Nazis, right? The reason why this is important and the reason why we need to also support the freedom of thought in this case is because we think the idea of the opportunity to discourse freely within society and the society's ability to moderate bad ideas and root out bad ideas are mutually reinforcing. We think only when we have these open discourse, we can naturally rule out these bad ideas so that people don't believe in them anymore. But secondly, we think that these ideas of, for example, within the Turkish People's Labor Party, the Turkish government, condemned and they broke apart this this party simply because of the reason that it might lead to Turkish violence or Turkish terrorism. We think this idea of arbitrarily the state making value judgments on people's freedom of thought itself is an oppression and the state's overarching power, and that it creates a chilling effect when it comes to discourse and people freely discussing ideas within the society. For these reasons, we think that even when you don't agree with someone's ideas, you do need to have a free discourse with them. Their ideas are also valuable in a democratic society. We're very happy to oppose.
We think that tolerating a political party that has an immoral, intuitively immoral idea and politically incorrect idea is something that does destructive harm on democracy as a whole. We think that such trend or tendency of trying to accept all ideas as if there was no correct answer, or as if there is no bad answer in the political arena itself is what kills our democracy. That's why, as opening government, we actually support the idea that when the political party has enough collectivizing power to actually concentrate these people, gather followers, and have enough power to pass legislation in the Congress that try to overthrow government or stir political order as a whole by instigating the people, well, that's the reason why we should actually prevent these political parties from forming in the very first place, and allow Supreme Court, which is reflective of the people, to actually have enough capability to dissolve when it comes to this matter. So before I move on to my questions regarding why first the existence of such morally incapable or politically incorrect parties' existence actually dilutes the spectrum of what sort of moral decisions voters can make, and secondly on why the specific context of actually why your freedom of belief cannot be absolute when it comes to forming a political party if it contains a harm. We think that direct response to OO. So OO comes up and says, oh, you know what? We have enough consensus and check and balance that we're not going to accept communism. Mr. Speaker, two levels of responses. First of all, it's not the matter of persuading all the people, all Korean people, to be communist that's problematic in the sense. We know that the majority of us have enough common sense that we don't want to have a dictatorship in North Korea. The problem is that, first of all, we still have 3% of followers for such absurd political parties that will still support us, support that immoral idea. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, it's not even about the numerical number, it's more about the power of those few radicals who are fundamental enough to actually carry out those ideas. That's why when the Supreme Court actually found the document on revolutionary organization regarding how they actually had plans, for instance, to carry out bombs, or how they actually focused on having an actual plan or gathering strategies to how to proliferate their idea of 주체 philosophy of worshipping the North Korean dictatorship or whatnot. We think that such flourishing is not impossible. It's possible without gathering all of us, like 40 million people of South Koreans or whatnot. So in that sense, we think that numericality is not the matter here. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, comes up and says, you know what, Supreme Court doesn't represent people and therefore we should not be doing this. Two levels of responses again. First of all, when we actually concede to the fact that Supreme Court can have a number of people who are designated by the president who actually represent the people who actually voted for the president, we think that it has enough majority of consensus for these citizens to be reflected within the Supreme Court's decision. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, it's not as if we actually have an authoritative decision of allowing the administration in the very first place to have an up-to-down approach of having her own arbitrary decision of dissolving the party. My PM has already come up and told you this lecture on history of how Korea, when you don't have a legislation, when you do not concede the power to the Supreme Court, which has enough representative power, but just that's what happens when a certain administration actually uses her authority or whatnot to actually dissolve those parties. That's the exact thing what we as having a legislation and ceding the power to the Supreme Court achieves, and we're proud to actually support that. We have already seen in cases of President Nomuyon, for instance, when things are arbitrary, even when the Congress or the people in those parties go against the president that they want to overthrow, we still see that reflection of the people's will was actually what became as a result of Nomuyon actually fulfilling his days in the administration and not being kicked out by Supreme Court. So in this sense, we think that we have already proven to you enough of how check and balance and representative power exists within the Supreme Court itself. No, thank you. Now, moving on to how absolute virtue or guideline the act has actually been existed. First of all, we talk about the context. We tell you that, actually we told you this. We tell you that even if we actually are not talking about the historical context of Korea, and we actually further extended onto the context of other liberal democratic countries, we're not at the very immediate scene of perhaps North Korean supporters or supporters of those philosophy that are directly adversary to our democratic philosophy and that actually threatens our idea of statuses or identity. We think that it's crucial that we talk about. What if those parties actually have incorrect ideas? I.e., what if there's a neo-Nazi party? Now, OO's stance was very clear when she said, oh, we're going to accept that. We're going to let them freely carry out their idea. Mr. Speaker, on two levels analysis, we think that such dictatorship of democracy, intolerance of those ideas, is what destructs democracy. Why is this? Because those rhetorics, those very offensive, far extremist, morally bad ideas have a power to spread out. That's why I see a rise in voters or followers within Germany, within France, Le Pen or whatnot, who actually say those absurd things. But the more even absurd thing is people actually believe those things. So when we say that we let those happen with ourselves, knowing that it's a bad thing, we don't think that's the way to go. Therefore, we think that when we acknowledge political agencies, no, thank you. We think when we actually see those agencies as a political party to have enough power to do those, to actually carry out those actions and gather those voters, we think that actually providing a guideline or at least preventing it from the very instance when it harms the society as a whole is what we have to do. We don't want to see neo-Nazis proliferating, but
if you're saying that having an idea of this political party itself is akin to the destruction of the democracy itself, you also said there's 3% of the population that support this. If you can find out who voted for this party, are you also willing to put them in treason or terror charges?
We think that there's a difference between the party who actively organizes those forms, who actively proliferates the philosophy. But even in that sense, my member has already clearly proven to you why in the cases where individuals hold those political beliefs in immediate situations, we do penalize them through a national security law, which is not mutually exclusive from our policy. But moving on to the second context of what history lecture 101, why the present status quo of in the present allowing this party to exist actually did harm on a diverse spectrum of people. So basically, throughout the course of 1970s or 80s democratic movement in Korea, we have seen diverse spectrum of democratic movements of NL or PL. It's not like all democratic parties actually opted in for communism. It's not like they all apply socialism to democratic parties. We think that there's a huge distinction between those parties. What happened and diluted the spectrum of voters in Korea was the following. When people naively assume that all democratic parties are like Punjindang, that they're all communists, and brand all those modest democratic parties like Hyeong, like New Democratic Party Associate Alliance or whatnot, we think that it's problematic because in order to win political elections, these parties will still co-ally with those radical parties just in order to gather and collectivize a voters who have to go against the conservatives or whatnot. So in that sense, Mr. Speaker, we think that in order to actually provide a spectrum and have a distinction between those political parties and distinguish that a modest, good democratic party that is not for communism from the one that is destructive, we think that we're the one who actually secure democratic movement, we're the one that actually revive the spirit of democracy, and therefore we're very, very proud to propose.
Essentially today, from the opening government, we hear a few things. One, the Supreme Court is the least bad alternative, coming from JD. And coming from Hyeong, she talks about how one intuitive public, the general Koreans, know not to go for communist beliefs. And then she comes up to the podium and tells us that powers of radicals are so strong that the majority is threatened by these radicals, when the majority already has a balancing power and balancing capability. Essentially, she talks about how plans could be so harmful, how these plans were tied to North Korea. But essentially, the Supreme Court released decision on Thursday showed that there was not enough evidence that RO was actually tied to North Korea, actually. And furthermore, we believe that the simple ruling in and of itself, and that plans or the harms that the Supreme Court ruled these parties against their existence, we feel that that's disproportionate punishment and simply absurd in a situation of democracy. Essentially, today's debate is about which model better protects democracy. Our model in which we incorporate the opinions of the enemies, or their model in which they block the opinions or deferring the opinions altogether in form of radical democracy. Mr. Speaker. Essentially, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to tell you a few things, essentially key in rebutting the points brought up by Minyo about radicalization. Now, the first point, very important one, is that in fact, instead of radicalization and whatnot, we see stigmatization of certain agendas. We see sidelining of important social agendas that happen, especially in all countries and especially within the Korean context. Now, first of all, we need to recognize in many situations, especially in many democratic countries, we see the Cold War era having an anti-communist sentiment being a widespread fundamental baseline upon which many democracies stand upon within the situation. Furthermore, these are the countries where this motion is quite prevalent. And we need to recognize that there is already an existing stigmatization of anything related to communism, related to socialism. We also see additional stigmatization, however, occurring when a government or a Supreme Court entity designates certain anti-social values as bad, undesirable, and evil, Mr. Speaker. No, thank you, sir. But further, we believe that it strengthens the anti-communist sentiment, strengthens the anti-any form of socialist sentiment that we have in the situation. The problem is that anything of even the remotest similarities will be stigmatized, which is why, especially in Korea, anything anti-Henry, anti-Bakune, anti-social welfare, anti-wealth distribution is labeled as partisan, labeled as commie, Mr. Speaker. And that's something that we see in countries that allow Supreme Court authorities to dissolve parties and block certain kinds of opinions being disseminated within society, and open discourse is prevented. No thank you, sir. No thank you, ma'am. No thank you, ma'am. Essentially, we believe that, in fact, it prevents even the existence of moderate parties when we have a government agenda that sets all aspects as wrong, red, and evil, Madam Speaker. In fact, we need an environment where more communist parties, more moderate ones, and more radical ones can talk about these kind of socialist issues, so that people can see, in fact, that among these socialist values and communist values, there are moderate ones, there are acceptable ones, and there are ones that can be integrated into policies of our situation. In fact, not ostracizing or further distancing these kind of even the moderate parties away from the mainstream beliefs of Koreans and the conservative majority of many of these democratic countries. No, thank you. No, thank you, JD. No, no, no. Essentially, to add on, in addition to the issue that it sidelines many of the important agendas, I'm also going to tell you more specifically why this is principally wrong. Now, first of all, we believe, Yori Chori has already told you that it's principally wrong in that it violates people's freedom of belief and political exercise. Now, she has also told you how parties are no different from the political rights and political expressions of individuals, is that parties are nothing more than a simple collective effort of individuals to pursue similar or equal political intentions. Essentially, today, what the government team has in mind is that they're going to criminalize every individual or party or any kind of organization that believes in certain agendas that the Supreme Court designates as undesirable and evil. Simply in their model and under their world, if somebody comes up to the podium and says, "Oh, I hate Bakune, I'm going to kill Bakune, I'm going to kill off all Henry Dems and Conservative Party members," somebody's going to come in and dissolve me. Essentially, that's not the kind of situation that we want, nor do we think that there's significant harms pertaining to that, which is why leads on to my next argument about the harm principle. And yes, closing, no JD.
If a political party imposes on the ability of other parties or groups in that country to participate in the political sphere of that nation, thereby breaching democratic values, why should they be given the same protection of democratic values and free speech? Okay, if they impose on the ability of other people to participate in the political sphere, they're imposing on democratic values. Why should they be granted that protection of democratic values?
Because that's what democracy is about. It's about encouraging other people to believe in the values that you also believe in. No, thank you, sir. Essentially, we need to talk about the issues of disproportional punishment, how this is a disproportional form of punishment levied upon to political parties. Essentially, the concept and the process of dissolving parties is a form of punishment. It's opposed to, unlike open interpretations against the party, nor is it bans on creation, which we also think is problematic, but it's a form of punishment carried out by the legislative branch of a country. Essentially, dissolving entails a direct harm and curtailing of the freedoms of a political party and the individuals involved within that party. And political parties political rights, no thank you, sir. Political rights of individuals are actualized through parties in a representative democracy, which is why we see direct harms and punishments upon individuals who pursue their individual political beliefs. And furthermore, we don't think any kind of harms were prevalent in the case, especially with regards to Dongjindang or any kind of these parties, such as the German Communist Party or the National Democratic Party. And furthermore, Yori Chori also gave you an example in which Turkish government dissolved the pro-Kurdish party of People's Labour Party, which resulted in international condemnations of Turkey for its poor democracy. Essentially, your efforts to protect democracy, in fact, leads to democracy failing in your country, JD, when furthermore, especially in a system of democracy where proportional punishment and fair legislative process is the most important underlying baseline. And what are the harms then of communist parties? We believe that communist parties are inherently, the government team needs to prove how communist parties are inherently harmful in every single situation to pass a motion that dissolve a party based on its ideology. And we believe that for they should have caused violence, tampered with elections, or waged open war to dissolve or actually do anything against a party. And furthermore, we also believe that like parties provide differing views within parliament, also within parties there are differing individual views and different views almost within the party members. And we believe that when party members commit crimes or do something against society, it should be individual party members that have committed these crimes that should be penalized and punished and incarcerated. And we also believe that once these members are incarcerated, we see more modernization within the parties themselves as well, which we don't think your preemptive argument fails. And furthermore, we believe that therefore it's disproportional in that it criticizes and punishes, penalizes an organization for the acts of an individual. And furthermore, we also believe that it's disproportional in that it punishes for harms that have never been committed. And furthermore, we believe that even upon ideology, this is problematic, which is why I urge you, Yuki, Weston, Tomoya, guys, to sign a negative ballot. Thank you.